Okay, as promised, I'm going to go over details concerning your VBA project. And I'm going to start out by just taking inventory of the sheets that are being displayed here, and then look at the instructions, and then finally I'll shift over and look at actual program code. So in looking at the sheets that are being displayed, this looks different than what I provided you. I provided you with the current active sheet, Start Data Proj1VBA. It contains row after row of data that originated in the registrar's office. And notice that I put a flag down at the very bottom last row contains a value end data. You'll want to probably leave that there, and when you sort the data and you work with the data, you'll want to avoid this line. The only reason I put that in there is it was a convenient way for me to control a while loop. So as I was traversing that column, one of the things that I did to control the while loop was to make sure that if that value was encountered, then we were at the end of the data. So hopefully that makes sense, and if it doesn't, then once you start coding and you've watched this video a time or two, it may make more sense then. Alright, so the original data and the instructions, and then what you have to do excuse me, is to create this insert row sheet, and you're going to have to create that in program code. In class I demonstrated some VBA code that would allow you to create a sheet. It had some error handling in it so that if the sheet name already existed, then it would alert you that that was the case, and would not attempt to create a duplicate sheet. But in any case, you'll need to create this sheet within your program. You'll need to transfer the data over, and then you need to insert blank lines, and I'm trying to read as I'm talking here. Insert the blank rows where the year value changes. Okay, so in this original data set, the data is ordered in ascending order by the data in column G, and so it's going to make it very easy to, just look down through column G, and anywhere the year value switches, it's at that point, like right here, that you're going to want to insert a blank line. So I'm going to basically give you that program code. You can analyze it, you can test it against this. So that sheet's going to be pretty easy to develop. But as you take my code and use it, then you'll want to understand the details of it. And as you are doing that, if you find that there's some inefficiencies in my code, certainly fix them. This is a proof of concept program, and I was really just trying to see whether I could do these things, and had it been a production program, I would have been more concerned about, am I doing them the most efficient way possible. But as you look at my code, again, you may find that there's some tweaks that you can do to make it more efficient, and feel free to do that. Also, as I mentioned in class and I mentioned in the documentation, every method, every subroutine or function that you use should have some documentation, and I gave some details on how I wanted that done with the author, the date, and the major features that of the language that were being used in that method, and then following that would be a very quick summary. Okay, so it's always a bit of a balancing act when you document something, you don't want to over document that almost defeats the purpose, and on the other hand, no or inadequate or inaccurate documentation is certainly not good either. But I leave it to you to show me your best documentation skills there. So we have the insert row sheet, and then another sheet that you have to create, and this is where it begins to get a bit more challenging, is you'll have to create this sorted sheet, and you will bulk copy the original data into the sorted sheet, and then you're going to have to perform a two-level sort where you sort by instructor, and then within each instructor grouping you will further sort with a secondary key of year, which is column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Column 7, you'll be using column 7 as the secondary sort key. Okay, so you'll sort the data, and I also tell you to insert blank lines at the point where the instructor name changes. Now, you're going to have to eventually use this sorted sheet in order to copy out the first instructor to a page that's named the same as that instructor, then copy out the second instructor grouping of data to another sheet that is named whatever that instructor is. So you're going to have to build these sheets, and the question is, when's the best time to do that? The best time to do that might be before you insert the blank lines. Okay, I'm going to leave that to you to figure out, but you might want to consider that. And there's the other thing is, I don't care whether you just automatically create those sheets as part of the number 3 requirements, or whether you add a button to do that manually. You might want to have a button that says build instructor sheets, and in which case it would need to traverse the data that's sorted by instructor, and then build whatever sheets are needed, however many instructors there are. But that can be done several different ways, and I'm going to give you a broad latitude in deciding how the best way to do that is. So once you have the sorted page, then you'll be copying out the data. I'll demonstrate that because I've written that as part of the proof of concept code that I did, and you'll see how your program should look at that point, what effect copying that data out should have on these individual instructor sheets. And then there's also going to be a button that needs to go out and clear out all the instructor sheets. And you'll notice that I've told you can use the macro recorder for the purpose of recording the VBA code necessary to do the sorting, and also you can use the macro recorder to generate the code needed to clear out the sheets. And I believe I demonstrated that in class yesterday, so using the macro recorder is a fairly simple thing. Just be aware, and I mentioned this previously, that when that macro code is recorded, it's going to be global to the entire workbook, and each macro recording is going to result in another module being added to Project Explorer. And so I have 2 macros at this point that are available to use. If I look at this one, this is the one that I believe clears out the form, probably. Is that right? Which one does this do? Yeah, this is the one that clears out the instructor sheets. So the subroutine heading up here at the top does not include the keyword private. Okay, so that's scoping it so that it can be used throughout any form or any sheet in the project, and it then can be called up the same as any other void type method or any other subroutine from, within a button click, for instance, with a call statement. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. So that's kind of a quick overview of all the sheets and a quick overview of the instructions. Now let me switch over and look at some program code, and I want to be careful in doing so that I don't expose program code that I've written for some of these other routines. So I may have to switch over and find the text file that contains the program code, that way I don't expose anything. But I'll run the program just to give you some idea of what buttons should be there and what kind of functionality those buttons should provide. This button right here, again, is code that allows me to create a sheet based upon data that is found. I believe I used either the insert or sorted sheet. Can't remember which one, but the important thing is I create a sheet from the column that contains instructor names. Now, since I already had all the sheets for the instructors created, I directed the cell pointer to the cell that contained the column heading and used the column heading, which has the caption instructor, used instructor as the name of the sheet. So long story short, if I click on this, it will fire off a message box at first and then add a sheet down here at the bottom. The other thing, and we'll look at the code one more time, I did this in class, but again, I'm recording this so that you have the chance to hear that lecture a second time and pick up on things that maybe you didn't pick up on the first time. If I attempt to create a sheet by the same name as an existing sheet, the code is designed to take a error path and display a message and say there's already a sheet by that name, choose another one. So again, my initial thank you message to Excel Macros for Dummies, and then because it finds a sheet named instructor, it's attempting to just I'm not sure where sheet 2 came from. It's attempting to alert me not to do that. All right, so I'm going to close that up. I'm going to stop for just a moment and switch over here. I think I can very quickly find something I'm looking for. All right, so here's the code that I gave you in a text file. That sheet that button click then that adds a sheet contains this code. So the actual button click event method is here. Notice that it is activating the sorted sheet, and then when it calls up this method add sheet, and I copied this off into a private method, but when it calls up add sheet, it's going to pass a cell value to the parameter. So I'm using this cell value as an argument that will pass to this parameter, and then this parameter value will be used to actually name the sheet. Okay, so there's the magic behind that. And I told you that you could have a button, that would do this. That's fine. Or you can make it just one of the tasks that gets performed in creating the sorted sheet, I think it is, so I don't really care. And if it becomes just one of the tasks that automatically gets called up, then you're still not going to have a problem with duplicate sheets being created if you make sure you provide an error handler, and that in that error handler you then just exit the subroutine. Fact is, I put an alert in here so you could see the result of the error handler. If that's left empty, then an attempt to create a sheet that already exists will simply just exit out of the subroutine, and the user will have no clue that that error path was ever taken. Okay, so let me get back to my sheet here. Alright, so we know what this button's all about, and then there's proof of concept code here to insert rows when the year changes. So if I go back to this and to the sheets, the original sheets, now I'm not sure, this sheet's getting created somewhere, just ignore that if you would. Okay, there, gone, you didn't see that. If we go to the insert row sheet here, you'll notice again that there are not any blank lines. On the other hand, if I run this button, it's going to insert a blank line anytime I click that button. So if we go back and take a look at the insert row sheet now, blank lines have been inserted where they should be. And I'm giving you that program code. So you'll have to, within the program, create the sheet. I did that manually. You'll have to make your program do that. But the actual code to insert the blank lines, I will give you, and then you're going to have to do that again with the sorted sheet. You'll have to insert, on a different condition, but nevertheless, the logic of that will be very, very similar, and thus the idea of this proof of concept code. So if we take a look at that code, and I want to see it through this button, I believe I added that code here. Yeah, insert blank rows. I went through this in class, and I'll let you analyze the details, but we're going to be looking at column 7, which is the year column. Like, that's actually the column with that's labeled column G, if I remember right. And we're going to be traversing the entire worksheet. And so at the point in time when we go from row 1 or row 2 to row 3 to row 4, and one row to the next, there will not be any blank lines. So at some point, as I look at the current column 7 value, the current row column 7 value, and then look back at what was on the previous column 7 row value, if I find there's a difference, that means that it's time to insert a blank line. So you're always going to have to be examining the column 7 value of the current row with the column 7 value of the previous row. And that's the nature of the decision. Where they differ, then you need to insert a blank line, and when you insert a blank line, you're going to have to kick up your row counter one additional time in order to move beyond that point. And so I'm using a while loop and that loop will, in this case, just continue to iterate so long as the current row column 7 value is not an empty string. When it hits an empty string, when it finds that to be the case, then it has gone through all the data. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. And again, you're being given this code, so that'll be helpful for adding this feature and also then using it with the sorted sheet. All right, so your program also needs to create the sorted sheet. It needs to then copy the data from the original sheet, which is start data proj1VBA, to that sorted sheet. It needs to run some macro generated code in a subroutine in order to do that 2-level sort that I described previously. And then it will need to insert blank rows. Now, if you do it the way I did it, code that I'm not showing, but I'll just tell you how I did this. I set things up like that, got the sorted sheet sorted in the 2-level sort order that I described, inserted the blank rows whenever the instructor changed, then started the cell pointer and let it count down to a blank row, and then that was the indicator that I was 1 row beyond the range that needed to be copied. Okay, so enough said about that. Hopefully that makes sense. And then finally, what I didn't show you yet is, well, I didn't show you this, and I'll show you how the copy should look, and I'll show you how the clear option should look. So I'll just run these real quick. And so the copy of the data from the sorted sheet to the individual instructor sheets is done here. And again, I should have taken these message boxes out. They were just there for debugging purposes, so I could see whether I was concatenating the correct range. Big hint, you're going to have to do that. And so eventually then, if I stop this and look at the sheets, I'll see that all the data for Austin has been copied out. There were 2 rows of data related to Austin, wherever Austin is. Austin's right here. And then all the data for Blanchard copied out as well. And you'll notice, again, I put the enrollment totals at the bottom of the enrollment column. I don't have column headings, but this data in column E represents the enrollment in each of these classes. And it's that way for all the instructors. So the last thing to demonstrate, I guess, is the button that clears out those sheets. And when you develop your program, it too should have a means by which we can clear out the sheets in case we want to run the program again. And as I look at the sheets, again, I executed that macro generated code, that macro recorder generated code, macro recorder, and cleared out all the data in the sheet and parked the cell pointer back in the home cell, cell A1. All right, I think I'm telling you everything that you need to know. If you watch this a time or two, then when you come back to class, you'll maybe be in a better position to ask follow-up questions, and you'll be in a better position to get started on this right away. Thanks.